Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Leonard, and today I'm with Dr. Jeremy Sammut. He is the Senior Research Fellow and the Director of Culture, Prosperity, Civil Society Program at the Centre for Independent Studies. He holds a PhD in Australian Political History and Social History from Monash University. He has published historical topics, for example, the Australian Federation, World War I conscription referendums, the women's suffrage movement, the white Australia policy, immigration, multiculturalism, and Indigenous affairs. Today, we will be talking to you about the flaws of corporate social responsibility and how good intended policies lead to disasters. His main research document, titled Curbing Corporate Social Responsibility, Preventing Politicization and Preserving Pluralism in Australian Business, explains this further. I'll leave that document in the links in the description. Jeremy, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure, Leonard.
Awesome. So I've been his intern for the last month. And I'm doing this. So recently, we all know that there was a financial scandal that happened across the 4 Australian big banks. And for example, executives like Ken Henry of the National Australian Bank resigned. So some might say that banks' negligence of customers and fraud is more of a problem. But what do you think about these scandals, Jeremy? Does CSR have to do anything with this?
Well, we've had these financial advice scandals, what is referred to as the no fee for advice scandals, where the banks and other major financial institutions have been found guilty by the Hayne Royal Commission of charging customers for services they didn't provide. Now, by anybody's measure, that's a pretty gross breach of ethical business practices. And there's been a certain irony to this scandal, which is that at the same time the banks have been found to have indulged in this very, very, very bad behaviour, to put it in very mildly. They've also been out there doing a lot of so-called corporate social responsibility activities, and that the idea of corporate social responsibility is that it's not enough just for big companies to make a profit any more in an ethical way. They have to go out there and be involved in particularly social debates. So there's sort of an irony there that at the time when banks in particular, but other big corporates have been out there, telling us how they need to, be more involved in these social debates to show, they're part of the community. They've actually been shown up by, failing to concentrate on their core business. And one thing that's led to is, well, it's led to two things. There's been a certain schadenfreude, or a bit of enjoying the displeasure of the banks, because the banks particularly played a big role in the same-sex marriage debate in Australia amongst a lot of corporates that are out there supporting the Yes campaign. So that sort of alienated them from a lot of more conservative people in the community who've sort of, I think, taken a certain pleasure in seeing their discomfort. But I think it's also left them open, particularly the banks, to hypocrisy, that they're out there, signalling their virtue on all these social issues, but at the same time they've, to put it bluntly, they've been ripping off their customers. So I think that this should hopefully be a bit of a moment where, business thinks a bit more, thinks purely in terms of, the business of business should be business, rather than indulging in these sort of corporate virtue signalling exercises, which can often distract them from what should be their main gain.
Yeah, and it's been evidently clear through these scandals that, like you pointed out, that corporations have indeed moved away from their main purpose of looking into the interest of the shareholders. And also the shareholders might be conservative.
Yeah, very much. Number of points there. One is that this whole notion of CSR comes from this idea that it's not enough just to look after the interests of shareholders, particularly the financial interests of shareholders, which is the purpose of the company. It's the idea that they've got to take care of broader stakeholders in the community. So that's the word that they use. Community groups, other people in the community who've got an interest in what companies do. Now, there's some justification for that. We live in an age when we're very questioning of the behaviour of all sorts of institutions, and I think corporates need to respond to that. And sometimes it can definitely be in their business interest to take into account environmental or other social factors, particularly when that might affect the financial interests of the business. But what we've seen is that this whole CSR idea there's been this huge growth in this, what I call an industry. There's all these people who work in HR departments that have now been rebranded people and culture departments. Across the consulting industry, CSR is pushed because they've got a vested interest in providing sort of advice and reports and audits that people need to prove that they're up to speed in CSR. And what's happened is that they're actually pushing not just for business to do CSR in the interests of the business and where it can legitimately protect shareholders' interests, but they're saying we've got to go further. So they talk about the next stage of CSR being getting involved in what they call systemic change, which is basically politics.
It is politics.
Basically politics. And what I don't think is signalled enough or realised enough in this debate is that when corporates get involved in political debates, they are essentially going to be politicising their brand and reputation, and we live in a free society, and that is going to alienate people who don't agree about those issues and the positions that they take. So what I'm really interested in what my work has been really focused on is how do we try and push back against this? And so I've come up with this notion of the community pluralism principle.
You have.
And what that basically says is that companies should recognise that while there is a legitimate role for CSR in protecting the financial interests of shareholders, what company directors and executives need to do is to make sure that doesn't get them involved in social debates that basically means they politicise their brand and alienate other people in the community who don't agree with basically progressive positions around all sorts of climate change or other social issues. And so what I want that principle to do is to give corporate leaders a way to push back and say, yes, there is a legitimate role for CSR, but we should not step across that line to get into what is basically open political activism, because it's not in the best interest of the company.
If I give you an alternative scenario, would it be okay for example, Alan Joyce of Qantas, of having a personal position in same-sex marriage without politicizing the whole Qantas brand?
Exactly. I think there is, of course, corporate leaders are private citizens as well as corporate leaders. They've got a right to spend their money any way they want to support any cause they want. But I think it's another matter when you drag a corporate brand into the debate, and that's exactly what we saw over same-sex marriage. The reality is that the corporate elites, if we can use that term, they aren't the company. The company is the shareholders, and the shareholders will have as diverse political opinions as the rest of the community. So they've got an interest in So it's really an issue of in a sense of appropriating the resources of the company, the resources of the shareholder, to play politics in a way that, as I say, I don't think is in the best interest of companies, particularly big companies like telcos, banks, airlines, which serve the whole community. And why would they want to be out there alienating potential customers by taking these political stands? I don't think that by default that seems to me to be not in the best interests of the company. And there's also the reality is that this sort of hyper politicization of all of companies, I just think is generally bad for civil society. That there are purposes that the company needs to fulfill, and it should be open to all talent. It should be open to all people who want to work for that company based on their merit. Should be able to do it. There shouldn't be this. What is also happening is this sort of quasi-political test, which we see being driven through these sort of diversity and inclusion agendas that are again driven out of the HR departments in the name of expressing the corporate virtue. But for a lot of people who don't share those opinions, that will be very alienating and an environment which maybe they don't want to work in.
Which undermines the principal agent problem as well, potentially, and also the idea that companies should be serving everybody, like essential services like banking and financial services.
The point here also is that companies only exist because the community grants them special legal rights and privileges. And I just think it's in the best interests of not only individual companies but of business in general for them to sort of respect the fact that they've got these privileges and not, as I see it, sort of abuse them by getting involved in these political issues, which, as I say, will inevitably mean they get alienated from significant groups in the community. One of the problems here as well is that I think a lot of corporate leaders, you only got to mention Brexit, Trump, and all sort of things that's going on politically to know that we live in a very polarised age. There's a lot of division between what we want to call the elites and ordinary voters. But part of the problem is that I think corporate elites live in their own little elite bubble, and they mightn't realise that the sort of things they think are just conventional wisdom or are acceptable and, progressive opinion within their own, little bubble of insiders who they live, work and socialise with. In the broader community, these are controversial political issues that, companies aren't in the interests of companies for them to be, campaigning on.
And in fact, you could argue that these campaigning per se and the politicization of these organizations is actually preventing the consumers to want to go back to the organization potentially.
Well, I think that's right. I think, it's just a matter of, I think the classic example was Qantas. That whilst of course some people would have cheered the role that Qantas played in the same-sex marriage debate, but I know a lot of people were also not offended's not the right word, but were didn't feel that this was an appropriate role for Qantas to do. So I don't know about what the commercial realities are, but I just don't think that if the justification for CSR is that it's about building the brand and reputation of companies, then I don't think you can justify that by getting involved in these political issues, which will inevitably and inherently politicise the brand and actually alienate significant portions of the community from these companies.
Totally. So, like you mentioned about the corporate world, we've seen a number of initiatives that introduce quota systems like gender and race quotas.
Yeah.
Is this part of CSR, you think? And obviously, I could argue it's anti-meritocratic, it doesn't do any justice.
Well, I think it is. Again, part of CSR is that people see the companies have to sort of be role models and model behaviour that people that they allege the community want. What often happens is that progressive advocacy and activist groups lobby them to adopt particular progressive policies on various things. We saw that over same-sex marriage, but we've also seen it in the gender space that diversity is the new, CSR initiative. That companies have to have diverse workforces. Apparently, there's claims that that leads to better commercial outcomes. I'd be sceptical of, those sort of activist-driven studies that prove that. But it has been taken up at the highest corporate levels in Australia. Both the Australian Stock Exchange and the Australian Institute of Company Directors have endorsed a 30% quota for female members of the top 200 listed companies in Australia. And that's been pushed and been adopted, and that's by 2020. That, going back to where we started, that had a sort of embarrassing consequence over the financial services scandal, because the chairperson of AMP was a female who, the impression was that she had been appointed to that position in some sort of, fulfillment of a quota idea. When the financial services scandal hit, that meant that not only was the hypocrisy of AMP sort of drawn out, that they've been charging no fee for service, but they've been charging fees for services they hadn't provided, but they're also signalling their virtue by appointing a female to the chairmanship. And that actually led to a sense that she was not the right person for the job because she hadn't been selected on merit, and she ultimately had to pay the penalty of resigning. So that's a little example of where these sort of social engineering initiatives that don't focus on what the real core business of the company is can get corporates into trouble. And I think more generally, I think we, particularly in companies, should be aware that of course we expect them to appoint on merit and apply the the liberal principles of equality of opportunity that we want, and that applies for women, different races, whatever kind of diversity you want to name.
I mean, I'm an example in CIS.
But what we want to ensure is that people who are particularly in position of leadership are making judgments based on merit in the best interests of the company. And so that sort of what I fear is that these sort of quota ideas will both undermine confidence in public companies. They'll also potentially de-skill them, because if the right people aren't in charge, that's not a good situation to be in. And so, the best kind of culture is one that rewards performance and and merit. I don't see, and I think, again, you're in danger of politicising workplaces if you suddenly decide that what really counts is your gender or your race. I think that's a good message. I don't think that's a really positive behaviour to model for the rest of the community either.
And it's a form of identity politics as well, isn't it?
Well, definitely. I've said when I was going through university in the early 90s, I thought that anybody who did a course with the name studies after it, as cultural studies or women's studies for that matter, I thought that they were taking a one-way ticket to the dole queue or being a waiter for their life. But the amazing thing, and particularly doing this work on CSR, is that there's also all those sorts of identity politics notions that I would have once dismissed as just woolly-minded thinking in the academy, have really found a way to insinuate them into the broader culture. And one of those ways, I think, is through CSR. Is that the HR departments have just imbibed identity politics, and they're all about equality of outcome, all about thinking that the most important thing about people and what determines their outcomes in life are their race or their sex. And it's across all corporates
and the universities also.
And so I guess the broader point here as well is that we need to again, we can't afford to think of universities just as ivory towers, as if they're sort of quarantined from the rest of society, because actually what's happening in them is having much broader social ramifications and influences, obviously across politics, but also, even in the corporate world, where you would have thought, perhaps naively, you would have thought that, because it's the business world, the bottom line and those sorts of issues matter, but these cultural issues are alive and well, and CSR shows that to be the case.
And undermining the concept of competence, the fact that if you're good at your job, that you get promoted and get better and rise up the hierarchy per se. But
look, I totally think there is a place for within any organisation to promote a culture of tolerance, acceptance, promotion on merit, regardless of all those things. But the way that identity politics encourages people to think is to say, it's not to ignore race or ignore sex, but it is to make sure that it's the most important important principle that's applied in making these sorts of choices. Now, I just think in the long run, if internally, but also in the broader society, what we're essentially doing is we are politicising race, we're politicising gender, and if we allow, and if you concentrate on what divides people all the time, and you not only do that, but you politicise in a way that rewards it, you're really playing with fire. There is a high likelihood that at some point there will be a pushback against this, and I don't think that's the kind of society that we want to live in, because a liberal democracy, by trying to use principles like merit and trying to use the old principles of colour blindness and those ideas, we try to develop ways that allow us to live together despite our differences and sort of overcome them. But what we constantly want to do nowadays is politicise them and turn them into weapons against each other. And I just don't think that's going to have a happy ending.
Which is the exact opposite vision that Martin Luther King Jr. had in the 1960s, that it's about the characteristics of your individual character, not necessarily the race or color of your skin.
Well, earlier, late last year, we had the English journalist Brendan O'Neill who was out in Australia, and I did an interview with him, which you can see on the CIS YouTube channel. And he actually says that. He says that, the identity politics view of the world has become so deep-seated that, nowadays, Martin Luther King would be seen as a racist for saying that race doesn't matter. And I'll just repeat what I said. I think, the best way that a liberal democracy can deal with these issues is to provide everyone with the same rights, but no more, and to try and, as far as possible, overlook superficial differences like race and gender, and focus on what we should be focusing on, which is ensuring that we have and respect the rights of all citizens. And that's what really gets me about the quota issue, is that, people sort of congratulate themselves on, we've got X number of defined identity category groups here, but if you haven't applied the principle of merit, what's going on internally in those organisations? What about the person? It doesn't necessarily have to be a white male. It could be a woman, or it could be, who isn't promoted based on merit. What does that do to the culture? And what does that do to social trust between, if we're competing for a job in the, we'd both be minority hires, maybe, but what does that do to our relationship? How does that affect? Am I going to help you out? Why should I help him out? Or, so I worry about that. I don't have any answers necessarily, but I worry about them, and I think and this is relevant to CSR.
Yes.
Because if companies are telling us that they're modelling how they want society to run, or how they think people want society to run, well, I think they better be careful what they wish for, because I don't think that would be a particularly productive workplace to be in.
No, and on your point, if I could chime in, I have a good friend of mine who is of Pacific New Zealand descent, and he got into law school legitimately, without the quota system or without the lower requirement. He got an A, and every time he went to a law lecture, his lecturer asked him, "Oh, did you get into the diversity program?" And he got offended. He said, "I worked my ass off to get into law school by getting A grades, and I'm getting delegitimized because of people in my community who are not willing to do the dirty work." And so it chimes in.
It's funny, I think a lot of this sort of, it comes from, look, as all these things do, to less, more or less, but often it comes from a good place. People, think, we want to try and overcome disadvantages, we want to be fair, we want to try and do the right thing to people. But they also have this assumption that the society in which they live in is somehow fundamentally rigged against everybody who is of a particular identity group. Let's say that. And to me, what's always struck me about that is that that identity politics view of the world, it doesn't lie to us about the past, because of course in the past societies were far more racist and prejudiced, and people would have experienced racial discrimination, but society, and sexual discrimination, but society has massively moved on. But the identity politics view of the world sort of ignores all that history and acts as if we're still somehow stuck in the 1950s or whatever, in these prejudiced times.
Way more tolerant.
And so it sort of lies to us about the kind of society we are today. And furthermore, it does it in a way which is, as I've said, which politicises all these issues in ways that I fear are going to be deeply counterproductive and are going to leave us in a far more divided state. Whereas I reiterate, what liberal democracy ideally does is provide everybody with the same rights as citizens, and doesn't just try and either discriminate or positively discriminate. Because I think, to me, they're not the same thing, but they can lead to
unintended
consequences, or sometimes intended consequences, but they can lead to a situation where I don't think it's a recipe for social harmony, put it that way.
Indeed. And speaking of the solution, you talked about just before the idea of the community pluralism principle as a solution. So how would this deal with all of this as a whole?
As I said, community pluralism is basically a way to try and wake up company directors, senior managers, to the fact that CSR can lead them down this path. It can end up politicising their company brands, alienate a lot of members of the community from the company, and in a way divert the company from any sense of focusing on the business of business and get them into political activism. And what I've realised is, as I've looked at this, is that the whole industry within business that is pushing this is so well established. They've got so many structures, so many frameworks, so many, even down to things like conferences, let alone the manpower and resources they've got to be able to push this both internally and in sort of business forums. And so I sort of tried to think of this, well, what if you're some sort of business leader and you're trying to push back against this, and you've got nothing. All you can sort of do is fight the internal battle by sort of pushing back on individual issues. Like, if you push back on individual issues, people will immediately brand you, say you're a climate denier, or you're opposed to gay marriage, and that can have professional repercussions. So what I tried to think was, well, what might help them in their world to push back? And I said, well, what if there was a principle that articulated all these risks and then articulated the reasons why you don't want to go down that political activism path? So this is what the community pluralism principle is. And what I hope, or how this might work, is that it's the sort of principle that could be put into corporate governance guidelines that the Australian Stock Exchange promotes, to guide how corporates have to manage their manage the governance of the organisations. So it could be in there, and so that if people wanted to say, well, look, this is how we should be judging what our CSR is and isn't. If it crosses the line to politics, well, we endorse the community pluralism principle, and we don't want to get into that. So that's the way. Other way I thought this could happen is that if shareholders, who don't really, it's very hard for them, because of basically it's the agent principle problem again. The agents are really the ones with the power rather than the shareholders. But if they got agitated about this, they could say, well, we want the community pluralism principle put into our company constitution to send a clear message to the directors and the senior managers that we don't want to cross that line either. We don't want the company to be politicised in this way, and it's our company. We're the shareholders, we're the real owners. So I guess I've, rather than just do what often happens in this debate out there, which is just complain, whinge about the fact that corporate lefties have taken over and all the rest, and all it's another example of the left marching through an institution. I wanted to try and think of what might be a practical way to do that. So I wanted to have some sort of institutional response to this and say, if we're really serious about stopping the politicisation of companies, well, not just enough to complain, not just enough to tell them to go read their Milton Friedman or learn company law, but we need to think about what an institutional response is, and so how can we help those within these companies and shareholders as well to push back against this.
And this is a solution that you come up with, which may work.
Well, I think one of the ways I've thought about describing it recently is that because another part of the CSR is that there's now shareholder activist groups, and they're basically left progressive groups who push companies. So the example now is that they've pushing and successfully pushing the banks out of funding coal projects, or they're forcing banks to and other investors to divest from coal industry because of global warming. And I thought, well, what I'm really talking about here is sort of shareholder anti-activism, and that's what do shareholders want? Well, they want their companies to be non-political. They want them to reflect the true owners of the company and the plurality of opinion within that group. And so here's the way they can do it.
And it sounds like a good one. So finally, you've been a think tanker for more than 14 years now.
No, only 12 years.
Excuse me, 12 years. And you've helped me out in the last month learning how to do research and find some documents and talking about political issues, particularly in our contemporary times. How different is think tank research to traditional academic research?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've got a longer version of that, which is that I've always said that being an undergraduate lies to you about being an honest student, and then being an honest student lies to you about being a postgrad, and then postgrad lies to you about being an academic, and being an academic lies to you about being a think tanker. But the thing that I've learned over the journey, and I think this is really what distinguishes, I call what I do applied scholarship. Very careful about the scholarship aspect of it, because the only currency we really have is the ability to accurately diagnose problems and then suggest solutions based on those evidence. So our work needs to be evidence based, otherwise we aren't, there's no real point in working in a think tank or a think tank existing. But where I think it's different to academics is that I've always thought that academics want to tell you why what they know is important, whereas I think with a think tanker, your job is to tell people why what you know is important to them. I think that is the difference, because ultimately what a think tank wants to do through its applied scholarship is to try and achieve policy change. And the first step in, particularly in a democratic society at least, where we don't live in China, is to make the public aware of why this is important, why whatever issue you're dealing with is important, and in a sense important to them or important to the community. So that's how I think being a think tanker is different to being an academic, and it really makes you, when you do your work, think more deeply about the politics of whatever issue you're dealing with. And I don't mean that in a partisan sense, I mean that in the best sense of the word, which is how do I convince my fellow citizens that they should be interested in, for one thing, this issue, but they should agree, as we do in democracy, to be governed according to whatever policy I'm suggesting. So I think it both, being a think tanker both engages you in the real world, but also in, what I like to think is that in the best sense of being a citizen and being involved in politics, again in the best sense of the word, in a democracy.
And the competing in the market of ideas as well, obviously.
Yeah, well, obviously, particularly a think tank like the CIS, part of our competitive advantage is that we say things that given the prevailing views within the academy, people often aren't prepared to say, or is not the natural habitat for people who want to say the kind of things that we want to say. So without debate we don't exist. And so the other idea that not frustrating, but the other misconceived notion about think tanks is that we're simply echo chambers. And I think, maybe that's true in some cases, but from my own perspective, anything but, because the only reason I want to do this is because I want to engage in a debate against what is often the prevailing wisdom or the prevailing view of something, and I want to take that on. But that, to me, is the antithesis of an echo chamber. We are engaging in debates, and if you look at I know all of my own work, you will see that I'm not just chanting an incantation about a particular issue. I'm engaging with a different and often prevailing view, and I'm trying to say, what's wrong? Here's what's wrong with this. Here's what the evidence says. Here's what I say based on the evidence we should do differently, and then that's the battle of ideas.
And there you go. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
My pleasure.
It's been a great long month working with you. Thank you everybody for joining us, and hope you have a good one.